So to start out this presentation, I thought I would just start with a quote directly from Elon Pape's book, 10 Myths About Israel. I think it just makes a really good thesis for this whole talk here. From our present vantage point, there is no escape from defining the Israeli actions in the Palestinian countryside as a war crime. Indeed, as a crime against humanity. If one ignores the hard facts, one will misunderstand what lies behind Israel's attitude towards Palestine and the Palestinians as a political system. Hold on a second, let me move this. And a society. The crime committed by the leadership of the Zionist movement, which became the government of Israel, was that of ethnic cleansing. This is not mere rhetoric, but an indictment with far-reaching political, legal, and moral implications. Ethnic cleansing is an action by one ethnic group meant to drive out another ethnic group with the purpose of transforming a mixed ethnic region into a, quote, pure one. Such an action amounts to ethnic cleansing regardless of the means employed to obtain it, from persuasion and threats to expulsions and mass killing. Coincidentally, consequently, the victims of ethnic cleansing include both people that have left their houses out of fear or expelled forcefully as part of the ongoing operation. The relevant definitions and the references can be found on the US Department and United Nations website. Those will not be provided there because I'm sure that you can all find those yourself. These are the principal definitions that will guide the International Court in The Hague when it is asked to judge these responsibilities for planning and executing such operations, such as they have done earlier this year and will continue to do at least a few more times as the cases continue to mount against Israel. And we will swing back to that later, but let's move on to our next slide. Let's talk about the early Zionist movement, because that's important to understanding a lot of this, since the ICJ and the UN were kind of results of a lot of these actions. So first, we'll talk about Karl Katznelson. He's one of the most important Zionist ideologues of the 1930s. He was known as a moral conscience of the movement. His support for transfer was unequivocal. At the 12th Zionist conference convened shortly after the British made their first proposal for peace, he was a strong voice and told attendees, quote, "My conscience is completely clear. A distant neighbor is better than a close enemy. They will not lose their transfer, and we certainly will not. In the final analysis, this is a political reform of benefit to both sides. For a long time, I have been convinced that this is the best solution, and this must happen one of these days." In those days, leaders like Katznelson hoped that the British would convince or induce the local population to leave. In an infamous letter to Ben-Gurion, who we'll talk about later, to his son Amos in October 1937, he already understood that it might be necessary to do it by force. Publicly that same year, Ben-Gurion supported Katznelson, saying, "The compulsory transfer of the Arabs from the valleys of the proposed Jewish state could give us something we never had, even when we stood on our own during these days of the first and second temples. We are given an opportunity which we never dared to dream of in our wildest imaginings. This is more than a state, government, and sovereignty. This is a national consolidation in a free homeland." And so I brought up Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion is the leader of the Zionist movement at this time. He was in favor of what they called voluntary transfer. The transfer of Arabs is easier than any other transfer since there are other Arab states in the area. And this is a sentiment that we still hear today amongst our politicians and the people that we argue with on social media. Why don't these other Arab countries just take the Palestinians? But he also argued that the transfer would be beneficial to the Palestinians without any real explanation of how that would pan out, suggesting transfer them to Syria. Of course, as many of us probably are guessing, this wasn't an honest position that he took. Um, at a closed meeting of the Jewish Advocate or the Jewish Agency executive in June 1938, it seemed the assembly members, including Ben, Katznelson, and Sherritt, and Yushkin, were all in favor of compulsory transfer, stated that carrying out the transfer, especially if the British did it, it would be the greatest achievement in the history of the Jewish settlement in Palestine. I favor compulsory transfer. I see nothing unethical in it, were his exact words. So a lot of this really starts to spin up quickly when Britain makes their full withdrawal from that Palestine area. When that happened, it reunited all of the conversations about what they were going to do with the land there and what they were going to do with the, the refugees that they had from the current Holocaust as well. So that led to a big spike in those conversations, but really there hasn't been a whole lot that's changed over the years. To quote some things that were said during the time, the Palestinians became refugees because, this was the Israeli defense, and we still hear this today. Sorry, I'm getting lost in my notes. The Palestinians became refugees because their leaders and the leaders of the Arab world told them to leave Palestine before the Arab armies invaded and kicked out the Jews, after which they could then return. But there's no such call for this. In fact, there's more evidence to suggest that Israel has just refused to enter negotiations over future or post-mandatory Palestine, or considered to return the people who have been expelled or have fled, while Arab governments and Palestinian leaders were willing to participate in a new, reasonable UN peace initiative. The Israeli leadership turned a blind eye when in September 1948, Jewish terrorists assassinated the UN peace mediator, Count Bernadotte. They further rejected any new proposals for peace adopted by the body that replaced Bernadotte. The Palestine Conciliation Commission, as new negotiations commenced at the end. So, that they just kind of brought an entire end to those conversations instead of continuing them. In 1949, America decided to get involved. We actually, up until this point, had been in support of Palestine, saying that they deserved to have their own state. In 1949, John F. Kennedy was one of the first ones to actually exert pressure, telling them that they should give reparations to refugees and impose sanctions on the Jewish state if they didn't comply. However, this was very short. Many of us know what happened with JFK. There is a couple of movies out there about it too that even tie into this. So you can explore those on your own, but those are out there. One of the first acts that Kennedy had done in front of the UN General Assembly was discussed in the summer of 1961. But this caused a panic with Ben-Gurion, who was convinced that the UN might force Israel to actually make them give reparations to the refugees. But they wanted Israel to, they had some Israeli academics conduct research that would prove that Palestinians left voluntarily. And so who did that research? Well, Ronnie Gabai, who was one of the researchers he was an associate researcher from one of the universities in Israel. What we know today as Israel of that time. Oh my goodness. With his permit, he accessed a bunch of hidden documents, a bunch of top secret documents, and he was able to conclude that people actually left because of fear and intimidation. He didn't find any evidence that there were Arab leaders telling them to leave, or that there was any threat of invading armies. It's of course speculated that this was an order that came directly from the Israeli leadership. That this, there was no other involvement from Arab states, other Arab nations, telling the Palestinians to come there. This was actually even researched more thoroughly and proven by a handful of journalists. One of the first journalists to do so was Erskine Childs in The Spectator. Picture of it over here. Very old article. So by the time we get to the early 1948, there had already been a lot of reports of Palestinians being forced out of their homes. This had caused a lot of violence. There were multiple deaths on both sides. There was a lot of stabbings and a lot of just kind of, people killing people, not like army type things, a lot of kind of terrorist attacks. And this caused Harry Truman to rethink about some of the plans that the United States was involved in at the time, involving this partition that they wanted to take place, essentially like almost a two-state solution, but not quite. He had the UN ambassador give them a 5-year period to kind of mull over a solution. However, this was very quickly denied by, we would call them AIPAC today, but it was the beginnings of AIPAC. Those forces were already there, and lobbying groups were able to intercept and deny that movement. And then this is where we come to the infamous Plan Dalit, or Plan D. Various deliberations on what to do with the Palestinians, because they obviously couldn't stay in their homeland, according to all of the officials involved in this. It came down from Ben Gurion, conveyed to his generals, told them that pretty much the fewer the Palestinians, the better. And that was well understood by his troops. As the end of the British mandate approached, and the British withdrew completely from Haifa, any territory that the British left, the Jewish state would come in and take. They even took more than they had originally agreed upon. The process began in 1948 with a few villages, culminated in April with the cleansing of Haifa, Jaffa, Sa'id, Bisan, Accra, and Western Jerusalem. The plan included the following clear references to the methods to be employed in the process of cleansing the population: destruction of villages, setting fire to, blowing up, planting mines in the debris, especially those population centers which were difficult to control continuously, mounting search and control operations according to the following guidelines: encirclement of the village and conducting a search inside it. In the event of resistance, the armed forces must be destroyed and the population must be expelled outside the borders of the state. The execution was even more systematic and comprehensive than it was originally anticipated. Within 7 months, 531 villages were destroyed and 11 urban neighborhoods were left totally empty. The mass expulsion was accompanied by massacres, sexual assaults, and the imprisonments of children. We come to today's numbers. Not a whole lot has changed. To go back to our previous slide, this is kind of what we see even still today in these discussions. Today, of course, Israel has heightened its force in the name of, quote, self-defense. Many of us are familiar with those alleged claims. To go over the numbers, in Gaza, there are 27,585 people dead. 11,500 of them are children, 8,000 of them are women. Over 66,000 of them are injured, 8,000 of them being children, 6,000 being women. More than 8,000 people are lost. Even in the occupied West Bank, where there is no Hamas, 383 people have been killed, including 100 children, and injuring more than 4,250 others. This is all since October 7th. Since then, Israel has also suffered casualties of over 1,000 people killed and over 8,000 injured. I will say that their number of 11,139 is recently revised down from 1,405, about 300 difference. So to swing back to the ICJ case, where we have South Africa bringing Israel to trial in some attempt to bring justice to the current actions in the previous past that has happened. In the case brought forward by South Africa to the United Nations, the highest judicial body, Israel stood accused of the intent to create conditions of death in Gaza. Israel's actions in Gaza have, according to South Africa's compliant, directly violated the Geneva Convention. South African lawyer Adia Hassim noted in her opening remarks, Israel has subjected Gaza to what has been described as one of the heaviest conventional bombing campaigns in the history of modern warfare. Palestinians in Gaza are being killed by Israeli weaponry and bombs from air, land, and sea. They're also at immediate risk of death from starvation and disease. Due to the destruction of Palestinian towns, limited aid being allowed in, and the impossibility of distributing aid as the bombs fall. This makes life impossible. Blenny, one of the other lawyers, also went on to describe the first genocide in history, where its victims are broadcasting their own destruction in real time in the desperate, yet so far vain, hope that the world might do something. This is a population that Israel has made vulnerable through 16 years of military blockade and crippling de-development. I thought that these were very powerful words. I watched all 6 hours of the ICJ case. I'm a little bit of a masochist, I guess, but the first 3 hours were a lot easier than the last 3, with South Africa's lawyers taking the podium. I thought that they were all very professional. They were very eloquent in their speaking. I believe that everything that they said was factual and true, and I believe that they didn't even leave out any of the things that I would expect to. They were more informative than American mainstream media has been this entire time. However, we'll come back to this because we have to talk about the Israeli side now. Christopher Stacker, a lawyer representing Israel, claimed that the inevitable fatalities and human suffering of any conflict is not of itself a pattern or conduct that plausibly shows genocidal intent. Given the relative weakness of the legal arguments against genocide, Israel's defense tried to limit the arguments to questions of procedural and jurisdictional viability instead of actual arguments. Israel's acting director of the International Justice Division at the Israeli Ministry for Justice, Galit Ragon, also rejected the claim that Israel had bombed hospitals. arguing that Israel had evidence of Hamas using, quote, every single hospital in Gaza for military purposes, while Israel's representative Tal Becker repeated claims of Hamas's embedding in military operations throughout Gaza, within and beneath. Yet reality has shown the opposite. Many of Israel's most outlandish claims, such as that Hamas uses civilians as shields and hospitals as military operation centers, have been shown to be either fabricated or grotesquely over-exaggerated. And while Israel feigns concern for civilian lives, it has ruthlessly razed Gaza to the ground. As was pointed out earlier, the genocide is being live streamed from Gaza to our mobile phones, computers, and television screens. As this image of destruction has been devastating, as the Israeli military has rained destruction on not only the areas it supposedly declared, but also the safe zones, evacuation routes, shelters, and hospitals. So following this, there was an update to the ICJ case just recently on January 26th, where they gave their, it's not an official ruling. You gotta love the slow bureaucracy, but it was a sort of temporary ruling that they gave. But finally, after months of street protest, thousands of us chanting in the streets and charging Israel with genocide, they had their day in court. And the ICJ ruled in favor of South Africa, but a little short of a ceasefire. In fact, very short of a ceasefire. What they did say was that at least some of the acts and omissions allegedly by South Africa have been committed by Israel in Gaza appear to be capable of falling within the provisions of the Genocide Convention. Israel is required to prevent and punish any public incitements to committing genocide against Palestinians in Gaza and to preserve evidence related to any allegations of genocide there, take measure to improve the humanitarian situations for Palestinian citizens. However, the court did not demand an immediate ceasefire because this was something that Israeli lawyers argued over and over again would provide an advantage to Hamas, giving them an opportunity to regroup and launch new attacks. So as I've said, this falls woefully short of any type of good news. While it's good that Israel's crimes of genocide and US complicity are being publicized so the world can see them, we as revolutionaries should understand that the capitalist state, the bourgeois courts, and international law will not and cannot stop US imperialism, Zionist state, and settler violence, or bring forth our liberation in any way. This has been outlined earlier in an attempt through going through the history provided in Elon Pape's book, where I went through sort of the history of the Zionist movement and how it infiltrated into our current culture today. Even the establishment of the United Nations in 1945 was presented to the world as an attempt to create international standards of law, or what is known as a rule-based international order. The International Court of Justice, where South Africa is presenting its case, that is, of course, the creation of the ICJ. That is their purpose, is to judge if someone is committing genocide. And of course, we know that Israel has been a partner with the party of the Geneva Convention since 1948, this entire time. And yet they have been allowed to essentially raze Gaza to the ground for 70 years with no accountability. So as a Marxist, We should argue that the law is itself a tool created by capitalist state to create, maintain, and preserve the power of the wealthy. Most laws protect wealth and private property, while capitalist owners legally steal the value of your labor to enrich themselves. The quickest way for workers and poor people to go to jail is to, quote, steal anything from capitalist owners. To make it even more real, it could even be you just losing your job because your boss just decided to fire you, and there's no real repercussions for doing that. There's no sort of workers' rights to protect you. All of the protection lies on the side of the corporations. But when it comes to international law, those were also created for wealthy capitalist states, meant to protect and preserve their own wealth. For example, when the United Nations created the Geneva Convention, it did nothing to challenge or dismantle the system of colonialism that existed when the UN came into being. It was perfectly happy to create laws pretending to create universal human rights when many people in the world still had no human rights at all. Israel provides an excellent example of this double standard. Since it was created in 1948, the United Nations has passed down numerous resolutions condemning its supposed violations of international law against Palestinians. Yet on more than 40 different occasions, the United States has vetoed these resolutions, rendering them useless. It has done so to protect its economic interests, like the Middle Eastern oil, through which Israel forces all of its access. This is in keeping with Marxist analysis of law, which identifies how bourgeois legality disguises the presence of class domination behind the mask of formal equality of access to power. In fact, the hearing before the International Court of Justice are full of legal hypocrisy, rooted in capitalist interest. The hearings are taking place in the Netherlands, one of the countries that participated in the bombing of Yemen, the same day as the hearings themselves. Those bombings were to protect Israel from the Houthis, who had attacked ships in the Red Sea to protest Israel's bombing of Gaza. In other words, the bombings were to protect private property. So while it is good that Israel's crime of genocide and US complicity are being publicized for the world to see, as revolutionaries, we should understand that the capitalist state, bourgeois courts, international laws will not and cannot stop US imperialism, the Zionist state, and settler violence, or bring forth our liberation in any way. We have to organize and do this ourselves.